GoPro Hero 11 features 10-bit recording in resolutions up to 5.3K, and that with frame rates of up to 60 frames per second. These are actually features that we usually see in professional cameras, but you don't really expect it from a small camera like that. So let's see if we can also make it look like one of the big guys. Let's start with the settings that I use to maximize the quality of this camera. And at first you take this finger here and then you swipe from the top to the bottom and then from the right to the left. And there you find the option video mode, and that is something that you should always set to the highest because that activates all the high resolutions, etc., all that great stuff. And next I will show you my different presets because most of the settings are actually all the same across all my presets, but there are a few differences depending on the shooting scenario. So as you can see, at first you find standard here, and that is 5.3K resolution and 24 frames per second with super view. And this is just a setting that I oftentimes use when I film myself on the motorbike because the camera is quite close to me then. So for that I want to have super view. I don't really care about distortion then. I just care about getting myself in the frame. Then I have the full frame preset. It's 5.3K, 8x7, 24. This is just a preset that I use in case I want to reframe the shot a bit more later and therefore I want to record the full sensor, or maybe also if I want to produce vertical videos, but I usually don't do vertical videos, so this is actually the preset that I use the least. And then I have activity, which is 5.3K in 60 frames per second and wide, so quite standard, a little bit distorted, but perfectly fine to use still. If you use this preset right, you actually don't see the distortion. It's especially for the horizon lines, etc. You don't want to bring them to the top or the bottom or other lines to the outside of the frame, because then you see this bending. But if you don't do that, then it's pretty much invisible, and that's great. 60 frames per second, I can always make a slow motion out of that. So if I want slight slow motion shots, then this is what I use. And then I have my cinematic preset here, which is 5.3K in 24 frames per second and linear. And that is the preset that I will show you in a moment, because that linear feature gets rid of all the distortions, and that's what makes this preset look a bit more like a normal or a bigger camera. And I have it set to 24 frames per second because this is what I record all of my videos in, and also the frame rate that I publish them in. So this is the standard preset that I use most of the time, that I would recommend if you want your footage to look more like a pro camera. And I have one more preset here. This is the ultra slow motion. This is 4K 120, also in wide. It's just if I want to have even more slow motion and 60 frames per second, then I use that. It still looks really good. You could also use lower resolutions and therefore ramp up the frame rate even more for even more slow motion, but I'm generally quite happy with how the 4K 120 looks from this camera, so I stick to 4K 120 here, because when I lower the resolution, and obviously I lose a bit of quality there. So much about my presets. Let's now get into the cinematic mode, and there, as you can see, 5.3K 24, lens linear, we had that already. Hyper smooth on, this is something that I have activated in all of those presets. That's super important. Actually all of the rest that you will see now is the same in all other presets. And then I swipe down because there are no changes to timer and scheduled capture, etc. You can leave that out. Then on the Pro Tune, you activate 10-bit because that allows you for better color grading. Then you set the bitrate to high because for 10-bit recording, you want the camera to capture as much data as possible, and for that you need this high bitrate. Shutter, I've set that to auto because this camera exposes via shutter all the time. Then EV compensation to -0.5 because if you slightly underexpose the image, you get a little bit more detail in the highlights. It's the same with all GoPro cameras, so I always have my GoPro set up like that. White balance, I have that set to 5500 Kelvin because 5500 Kelvin is the number that you would need for daylight conditions, and I most of the time film in normal daylight, so I just leave it like that. But if you film in cloudy conditions, then you should set it to 6500 Kelvin, and if you should film inside, just set it to automatic because there it's really hard to choose the right one, or also leave it to 5500 Kelvin. It sometimes works also. It really depends on the light situation. And from there, ISO min and max is set to 100 because I don't want this camera to adjust the ISO. The sensor is so small already that I want to keep it as low as possible to not introduce any noise in my shot. And sharpness, I've set that to low because I don't like this over-sharpened look. It makes it look a bit more like a smartphone. So by setting that to low, you get a pretty nice, soft but still detailed look from the GoPro. This is actually what I really like about GoPro cameras. They are not this artificially sharp like your phone, for example. So keep that to low. If it's too soft for you, you can still set it to medium. That still looks pretty good, but I wouldn't set it higher than that. And the next setting here is color, which I've set to flat to maximize the dynamic range of this camera, so you can see more details in the highlights and the shadows at the same time. It's also a setting that I always use with all GoPro cameras, but if you want to do a bit less color grading later, you can also set it to natural. You will lose a little bit of dynamic range then, but it still looks really, really good, and the natural color profile actually is quite nice. When it comes to wind reduction, our next setting here that I adjust, I would always turn that off, because if it applies wind reduction, it never really sounds good. And after that, under shortcuts, you can also choose whatever setting you want there, whatever shortcut you want to have on your screen. But what I recommend you to set is upper left or whatever you want to white balance, because then you can quickly adjust the white balance in case the weather changes from sunny to cloudy or you want to go inside a room or so. But aside from that, the rest is really not that important. It's really up to you. But now it's time to go out and give you some tips on how to shoot with the GoPro Hero 11 so that your shots look good. Okay, I don't want to overcomplicate things here with the GoPro Hero 11. There are two things that I want you to focus on to get better shots with any GoPro and any camera in general. That is at first lighting, and second it's camera movement. So for lighting, you see we're here at sunrise. You can also go for sunset. That always gives you the best light. That's a little secret, but it's not so much only about what time of the day you go shooting, even if that matters to a large degree. It's also how you use the light. And there's one technique that I want you to remember here, which is backlighting. Backlighting is essentially what I'm doing right now here. The sun is directly behind me, so it should cause some rim light here around my body. That looks beautiful. And the second one is this angle here, side lighting, so that one side of my face is lit up, and you probably also see a little bit of light here, but also a lot of shadow. The reason why you want to do that with GoPros and any other camera is that the sensor is flat, the screen is flat, so your image is flat, but you want your image to pop. You want to have it three-dimensional, and the only way to really achieve that is by playing around with light and shadows. And by either using side light or backlight, you always have this three-dimensional effect. This is why you want to do that. So let's get some quick shots with the GoPro Hero 11 here, and I'll show you how to actually use that. So for the sake of this video, I will only do a quick 3-shot sequence here. I will film one shot of the surrounding, maybe another one, whatever comes into my mind, and then a wide angle shot of the airplane here to basically give an introduction to the airplane. You can actually do that like I will do now in your travel videos, because, well, you introduce a place and then in the next scene you could show what you do at this place. So let's get first one shot here of the plants, and it's like the sun is slightly coming from the side, so we get good light here, and I will simply do a slight movement with the GoPro for it to look good. And that's like my second tip here, to get nicer shots with your GoPro. The stabilization is really good, so use that to your advantage to move the camera around. It's actually quite easy. You just press record and you hold it in the direction where you want to shoot, and you move it to the left or the right. It's definitely not the nicest shot here. We don't have the nicest background, but I just want to get one shot that doesn't really show the airplane at first, so that it makes the viewer curious what's happening next. Here's my next shot. I just filmed the textures here from that airplane wing. So I only hold the GoPro in here against the light and I move it over the surface. I shoot in 4K 60 right now, by the way. Also in linear. It's nice when you go close to things, even with your GoPro, it's like you don't show too much, but you still keep it interesting. So now our third shot to reveal the airplane. Okay, so here wide angle shot now. Again, I hide behind plants here, because when you have foreground objects that are really close to the camera, then even small camera motion becomes more noticeable. So always try to put something in the foreground. It's easier for you to actually show camera movement. I can actually show you that. Let's first do a shot like that here, where I moved the camera around. You see the camera movement a little bit, but not much. But now when I do the camera movement behind those plants here, the motion, the camera motion instantly becomes more visible. So let's do it like that. So you can see how easy that is. Just put something in front of the camera and the motion becomes more visible. At the same time, by going low and pointing the camera up, the airplane also appears to be a bit bigger. So that also makes the shot look a bit nicer. So really focus on these two things mainly. Put the light source behind your subject or to the side and use camera movement to your advantage by putting foreground objects in the shot and then simply slide the camera around. It's actually that easy. And by the way, the big mistakes that many beginners do, don't just walk around with the camera and shoot all around you. Focus on getting single shots. You also learned it in my how to make cinematic travel video guides. This is like the key tip that I always mention there, because the moment you start getting single shots, one shot after the other, trying to tell a story with it, that is where your videos really kick off. And it doesn't matter if you use a GoPro, your phone, or a bigger camera. But now it's time to go back into the studio and show you a bit more on how you can make your GoPro footage look even better. Boop. Okay, now it's time to do the actual magic to your footage to make it look more like a pro camera. And I have two ways to color grade GoPro footage here for you. And I also have another tip for you that actually makes it more like a pro camera. The first one is a plugin that I oftentimes use to color grade my videos, and that is also the sponsor of today's videos, which is Film Convert. And that plugin is available for DaVinci Resolve, for Final Cut and Adobe Premiere. So no matter which professional NLE you use, you're covered with this plugin. And it's actually quite straightforward to use, so let me show you how it works. You first drag it onto your clip, and from there you can choose camera profile. Of course, there we're shooting GoPro Hero 11 and then flat. You can also choose the natural color profile there if you shot in that, so it doesn't really matter. And now you can see that it's way too dark. So the first thing that I want to do is, like always, bring the grain strength slider down, because I don't like noise in my shots. So I prefer to have it without any grain there as well. And then I adjust the exposure slider here because it's way too dark by standard. It's a bit like developing a RAW in Lightroom. Like you underexpose the shot, then you bring it all back. After the exposure adjustment, I see that the temperature and tint is a bit off. So I at first bring the saturation slider up so that I can see better where the tint is. And now I can see that it's a little bit too magenta looking, and it's also a little bit too cold, which is why I will adjust the tint and temperature sliders here until it looks good. And there you can see that instantly looks really nice. Definitely not like GoPro colors anymore. What I like about Film Convert and generally like film emulation is not actually the colors of it, but the graduations over the image. Like everything pops a little bit more, it looks more three-dimensional. And this is not just the same as normal color grading, like at least not making that quick. You can achieve something similar with color grading, but it's a lot more complicated, and that is why I love Film Convert so much. It's just a few buttons and a few sliders that you have to use there, and suddenly it already looks really good and pretty close actually to analog film cameras. And that's actually all you have to do. If you don't like that film stock here, then you can actually change that. For example, another one that I oftentimes like is the Kodak P400 Portra. It looks a little bit more balanced, I think, like the Vis 3 here from Kodak, for example. It's a little bit more on the warmer side. It looks a little bit like a tint, but then when I choose the Kodak Portra, maybe because it's a little bit more greener looking, it's just overall a wonderful image there. So that was the first method here with Film Convert. I will leave a link to that plugin in the description below. And by the way, it's only a one-time purchase and you own it forever. It's a lifetime license, and they always release new packs for new cameras. So if you buy a newer camera in the future, you will also be able to use that plugin with that camera, and it doesn't cost you anything extra. And I think because of that, it's actually incredible value. But now it's time to show you the second method, and that is completely available in the DaVinci Resolve free version. So if you don't want to pay anything for your video editor, you can use that, and it also gives you really nice cinematic results. The second option might look a little bit more difficult to you, but you only have to copy what I show you here on the screen and then you get it directly. So let's get into it. The first thing that you want to do is to add 3 nodes in your nodes panel here, and then you go into the second node, and there you insert a color space transform, and then under input color space you set it to Rec 709. Also the input gamma as well to Rec 709, and output color space, what do you guess? Also Rec 709, and output gamma. No, not Rec 709, that's Cineon Film Lock. It's clear, of course, right? No, of course, you wouldn't know that without watching a tutorial. So just copy those settings here. In the next node, you simply click on LUTs, and then in the LUT panel, you find the folder Film Looks, and there you find the LUT Rec 709 Codec 2383D60, which is a look that is oftentimes used, or a film stock that is oftentimes used in movies. So you apply that, and now you instantly see that it looks more like a proper image already, but in that case, it looks a little bit too bright, and that is why you go now into your first node, and then under the HDR wheels, you can make an exposure adjustment. So let's slide it down here to negative 0.6. And I also want to give it a bit more contrast here in the primaries panel. And under saturation, I also can give it a bit more saturation. And I'm not that happy with my tint and temperature sliders as well, so I also do some adjustments there. And then you can see it actually also looks like a really nice image, and definitely not like GoPro anymore. And that's simply because you just gave it a film look by doing that color space transform and then applying the LUT. Now, the reason why I did the adjustments in the first node is that it's always better to do adjustments in the first node, like before the color space transform and the LUT gets applied, because especially the LUT reduces the color information. So if you would do those adjustments after the LUT gets applied, it's more likely that you get artifacting or so. So it's always better to do that. It doesn't matter if you have 8-bit, 10-bit footage or RAW or whatever. It's always better to do that before LUTs get applied. And yeah, there you have the result. Looks great in my opinion. Of course, if you want to, you can do more color grading. You can do HSL curves, etc. to shift the colors a little bit around if you don't like them, maybe to desaturate the greens or to make it more orange and tealish looking. But I think you will be perfectly fine just using this look. So I will leave it like that for now. And now let's come to the bonus tip that you can, as far as I remember, also use in the free version of DaVinci Resolve. And that's called the Depth Map. So here's the thing with GoPro cameras. They have a lens that keeps everything in focus in front of them and a really wide angle lens. And this is why GoPros or generally cameras with such small sensors look a bit different from normal cameras, because the lens is different. Like even here in my studio, you can see that the background is blurry, even if it's not that much anymore because I'm using a wide angle lens here. But on GoPro, there's nothing blurry in the background. So we want to use a depth map now in DaVinci Resolve to fake that. So to do so, we add 2 nodes here after your color grade. And the first node here is the depth map. So I search for the depth map effect and I drag that in there. And then I at first click on invert, because we want to have the blur in the background and not in the foreground. And then I also activate adjust map levels and I drag the near limit a bit down while depth map preview is activated. And now when you look on the preview, you can already see this white and black areas, and the white areas will be what will be blurry later, and the gray areas slightly blurry, and the black areas, they will be completely sharp. And then you turn the depth map preview off, and now you click on this blue rectangle there on the node that you just used for the depth map, and you drag that to the next node, and in the next node you apply the lens blur effect. And there you only have to adjust the blur size, and I would suggest to not give it too much blur here, because despite wanting to emulate a bigger camera or a bigger lens, you still are limited by the wide angle capabilities, and wide angle lenses generally don't have as much blur as tele lenses, for example, have, or standard zoom lenses. And that is why here I also only want to give it a little bit of blur. So my case here 2.2 I think looks pretty good, and this is all you have to do. Now you can play it back, and as you can see, the background is slightly blurry, while one after the other this heart-shaped trees here or whatever it is, plants, come into focus. So it doesn't look like a typical GoPro anymore, and that makes it so beautiful. You definitely notice that even my M1 Max here is already at its limits. It's stuttering here, it's lagging around, it's not smooth anymore. So when you render your video after that, it will definitely take a bit of time. But that is always the thing with gear. You either spend a bit more money on your cameras, or you spend a bit more money on your editing machine so that you can do stuff like that. It's at least nice that DaVinci Resolve gives you that in the free version and with a bit more power also in the studio version for a pretty affordable price, I would say, because it's also a lifetime license. So I would clearly say that it is possible to make the GoPro Hero 11 look more like a pro camera. It really depends a little bit on how much you want to work it in post. But aside from that, you don't necessarily need a GoPro Hero 11. The GoPro Hero 10 already color graded really well, surprisingly well actually. So if you want to save a bit of money, then just get the 10 probably. It's good enough. Even the Hero 9 and Hero 8, they are already pretty good. I will just leave links to both the GoPro Hero 11 and 10 in the description below. If you don't have it yet, just check it out there. That supports the channel a little bit. Aside from that, let me know in the comments below. Do you use the GoPro Hero 11 and what do you think of all its no specs? And do you think that that already looks not like a GoPro anymore? It's definitely nice to hear from you. And if you want to know what I did with the GoPro Hero 10, then check out this video here in the corner. There you will learn more. And aside from that, if you found this video helpful, please leave me a thumbs up and consider subscribing for upcoming videos. See ya!